So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. So for my regular listeners, or watchers I should say, because if you're listening, you probably won't have noticed that I am in a different location today. So Dana is going to bear with me as I try out these new acoustics. And so I'd like to welcome onto this podcast is Dana Price. So Dana is the CFO of LifeLabs Learning. So she has joined us today, and actually we're going to explore a few topics, but welcome Dana. Thank you very much for joining me on the show today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No, it's fabulous to have you. And thank you, obviously, for those that can't tell from your accent, tell us a little bit about where in the world you are today.
Sure. So I am clearly an American. I reside in New Jersey, northern New Jersey. So I live right outside of New York City. I'm also fully remote, so I don't actually have an office to go to. And I've been in this part of the world my whole life. I have traveled and worked in many different locations, but I have never actually moved.
Wow, I think that's the exciting thing, isn't it? About certainly as a consultant, I have found since COVID, actually the world of doing things like this podcast, but also consulting literally across the globe is a really exciting piece. But I'm going to say I can't confess I have actually moved in between things, so I've not quite hit your mark, Dana. So thank you so much for joining me today. So tell us a little bit about your background. How did you end up as CFO at LifeLabs? What's your journey been?
Sure. So my journey is a very heavy M&A background, mergers and acquisition. I am an accountant by training, so I do geek out on numbers occasionally, but I have had multiple, accounting roles and CFO roles, and it has been a journey of accidentally ending up in a private equity-backed portfolio company. Not coming in as the CFO, but sort of coming in as the first lieutenant and then becoming the CFO, and really just sort of understanding what that was all about. And wow, these folks are really smart, and I better up my game. So, having that sort of ownership to answer to and to provide data and work with was very intriguing as a younger individual. And I preferred that type of environment to work in, and, have traveled throughout the years. I've worked in big and small companies, public companies, private companies, PE-backed companies, VC-backed companies, and have ended up here today primarily just due to ownership and the company being acquired by a private equity sponsor this year, and coming in at the start of basically the journey of this private equity ownership. So that, along with culture and the ability to do cool things. So
I think that's it. Is that and I always love it how that in finance now we are talking about doing these awesome things, right? And how exciting it is to be a part of finance, and that's one of the bits that I love both about this podcast and my day job, is that I get to have conversations with people that are on these really exciting transformation journeys. So tell us, you made a really interesting comment there about you loved working, you've actually really thrived in that PE environment particularly. Tell me a little bit about how you see the differences. Like, what did you notice when you moved into it?
Sure. Yeah, and there are differences. So, there are differences between a public company, a private company, a VC-backed company, a PE-backed company, a founder-led company to a PE-backed company. And I think, some of the things, off the bat, number one is reporting. Usually reporting is a big change depending upon what you're coming from. And what I mean by that is, let's say if you were founder-led, maybe, you're looking at net income or cash or things like that. Whereas if you're private equity owned, you're probably at a minimum looking at EBITDA and potentially free cash flow, levered, unlevered free cash flow, things that are non-GAAP terms. Here comes the geeky Dana, but non-GAAP measures. If you're coming from a public company, chances are you've always focused on reporting out, obviously on a quarterly basis with a set number of days, GAAP earnings, GAAP related measures. You might have some non-GAAP measures in your filings, but you're generally being measured around GAAP. Whereas most private equity firms are looking at non-GAAP measures, and the difference between earned revenue and billings and bookings. Those are two different measures. And understanding, do you have the systems to measure the non-GAAP measures? That's, always a question. Things like the mundane, a non-disclosure agreement. You have to now focus on the length of your non-disclosure agreements. Most private equity firms will not or don't want you to sign an NDA longer than 1 year. So the term of certain things might change. The word, now I'm going down the geeky contract legal side. The word affiliates sounds innocuous, but when you're private equity owned, your private equity sponsor is an affiliate. So you need to make sure when you're signing legal agreements that you're not binding your private equity sponsor, and because that could be a big thing to them. Clearing conflict. If you're acquisitive and looking at deals, if you do sign up, sign an NDA, you're often having to clear conflict with your private equity sponsor to make sure that they don't have an NDA in place or they haven't looked at that acquisition. Debt compliance. If, again, coming from different kinds of companies, if you're not familiar with debt or debt compliance, private equity firms are, generally folks that are probably going to, if they're either going to put something from a little bit of debt to medium amount of debt to potentially some highly lever up a company, which makes a CFO sort of wake up screaming at 3 in the morning sometimes. But that aside, so you need to understand what their appetite is for debt. And, if you're coming in at the start, how are they going to lever up the company? Are they going to lever up the company? Is the company already levered up? Are you delevering the company? Those are, pretty key things, because as the CFO, you're obviously going to be the person doing the compliance certificates and being responsible with the credit facility. Things like when your financials are due, simple things. Maybe if you're founder-led or a small company, maybe you get around to wrapping up your financials 30 days later. That's probably not going to work for a private equity sponsor. It probably needs to be a little bit faster. And, trying to close that gap of time is also something, that doesn't mean you have to just turn it on tomorrow. Here you go, here's your financials, but you have to have a plan. Let's see what else. Data requests. If you're not used to being asked for different types of data at different times of the year, with either long windows or really short windows, private equity firms need data at certain points, and they are not folks who ask for data just because they're asking for data. They are generally asking for data because they need the data, whether it's for a filing, FINRA something. It depends where their funds are, coming from. So they're asking for data for very specific reasons. So you always want to be conscious of that, and understand, when do you need this data? Because sometimes they ask for data. You're like, ooh, how am I going to get that data? I've got to go here and pull pieces out of different systems. So you just want to understand what their general requirements are. You also want to understand, how they work. And what I mean by that is, how do they interact with the management team? Who are they specifically interacting with? How often are you going to interact with them? Are they a long investor? Are they, a private equity sponsor that's focused on turnarounds? Go fix your business, get me the EBITDA, and I need to be out in 3 years, is very different from a long investor who's like, take your time, we have patience. Yes, I'm willing to invest. The invest level and the debt levels are definitely something you want to understand before you walk in the door, because if you are going to be heavily levered, you want to know that, because there are going to be times where you wake up at 3 in the morning and you're like, what happens if this doesn't come through? Or, in an economy like today, oh my God, am I going to blow my covenant? And quite honestly, if you've never blown a debt covenant, you really haven't lived. Okay? 'Cause you learn a lot when you blow a debt covenant. And I have in the past, multiple times. So you learn a lot through those things. So I'm just going to pause there and see if that actually answers your question.
It has, but do you know what? It opens up so many more questions. And one of the things was interesting was you were implying or saying almost that each one is slightly different, will have slightly different approach potentially to how they want things to be managed, and almost their comfort levels, like you say, with debt, and their expectations around reporting potentially. So how many different private equity companies have you actually worked with? Have you worked with quite a few, or is it, what's that experience like?
Probably about a handful. So maybe about 5 or 6. And they've ranged from incredibly large, with names most folks would know, to fairly small, and primarily focused in certain industries. So the barometer has moved from 180 degrees.
And how, because obviously you mentioned about managing, obviously, the role of CFO manages that relationship with the CEO, with the board, but how much management of the private equity team is there, and what kind of contacts are you working with on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So usually in a private equity sponsor, there's sort of the partner and the person who was responsible for doing the deal and, bringing your company into the portfolio. Then below that individual, there is usually someone who I consider the individual that executes things, and maybe execute is a bad word to use, but the person that's going to get everything.
Maybe very appropriate, to be fair.
Well, in certain instances, that is true. But the person that will get everything done. And then there's usually analysts below that individual who are the folks that are like running all the numbers, taking the data requests and doing their own analysis for whatever they need, and grinding the numbers. So there's 3 different levels. Usually the partner is, and potentially the person that's in the middle is on the board. So you're interacting with both of them from a board level perspective. And then, I would say generally I'm talking to the private equity sponsor at a minimum once a month, depending upon where we are at the company in our journey. It could be a lot more. There was an instance when you're recently acquired. So I was probably talking to the private equity sponsor twice a week initially. And that could be things where, all right, we have a new credit facility in place. We need to make sure, coming up on the quarter, have to do a compliance certificate, simple things. Where does this number go? Can I add it back? How does this affect what you intended the agreement to state, to anything like, let me explain the business, or this is how it works. No one is going to know the business better than you and the management team, but you will sort of talk to different layers of the folks at the private equity firm because they all need different things. You may be talking to their tax team. Depending upon what type of company you are, are you a U.S. company, are you a foreign company, are you an LLC, are you an Inc., are you, a foreign nonprofit? Like, how does all of that work? Tax becomes very, very important. From where are your operations? Where are your people? Do you actually have nexus in a country that you hadn't thought about? Foreign exchange. They might have treasury folks that you might want to work with from a funding perspective. Or there could also be legal, general counsel or various folks in their legal department that you might be working with on certain things. And then if you're acquisitive and you're opportunistic and you are going to do deals, there's obviously sort of the deal team that you would work with.
Awesome. So it sounds like there's a lot of relationships at different levels, and depending obviously on what hat you're wearing, what hat they're wearing, there's a lot of management of that relationship. And how do you manage sort of balancing the needs of that private equity company with the internal stakeholders within a business, like the exec team? How hard is that to actually balance?
Yeah, it depends upon the day and the week and what the ask is. I think what you want to do is sort of out of the gate understand, what is your style of work? And that's literally a question you need to ask the private equity sponsor. How do you work? What is the interaction? How often is the interaction? What are you looking to gain insight on? How frequently? How can I help you? What have we provided that helps you, or what haven't we? Key question. What haven't we provided you that you actually need? And then you have to understand sort of all of those pieces and where the asks are coming from, so that you can go back to the exec team. And, I'd say the CEO is probably talking to them weekly, bi-weekly basis. There's usually check-ins, especially when you're early in the deal versus later in the deal. And it sort of, think of it as a bell curve, as you get sort of static quo, you're probably in a better space where you're talking to them less because you're on autopilot. As you start to get close to the exit point, and if you're in a private equity sponsored company, there is an exit. Like, it's just, there's no doubt about that. There's an exit coming. Then, it'll start to go up and you'll start to talk to them more and more because of the transaction. So the CEO and the CFO are the ones probably talking to them the most. If you have a COO or maybe a CRO, they're checking in with them at various points. But I think most of it will fall on the CEO and CFO. And most of the companies I've been in don't have a COO. So the CFO and the CEO are generally playing the role of sort of translator, traffic cop sometimes, and sort of, the bridge to the exec team. And what we often do now is also take our conversations back to the executive team. And so we meet with the executive team on a regular basis and say, hey, by the way, the private equity sponsor asked for this, or this individual is looking for that information. They feel they don't have enough insight into our business regarding X, Y, and Z. So you are often the bridge to that, being the CFO and or the CEO. Did that actually answer your question?
It did. And it sounds like there's a bit as much about managing the communication of what the PE company's asking for, so that the business knows perhaps where it's got gaps in how it's communicating in different areas, as much as and sort of keeping that awareness internally of what those investors are looking for, as it is about actually providing information to that company.
Absolutely. Investor relations is also part of a CFO's role as at a private equity sponsored company.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And there's probably a little bit of politics involved in that as well. And so, when you've been involved in obviously these different companies, have you been involved sort of pre-private equity and then taking it through a journey, or have you mostly come in once that that company, that private equity company, has been on board and they've been through a funding round?
Let me think about that for a second. Primarily, I seem to have either come in at the start, or slightly after.
So in the early stages of that investment cycle, and is it a shock to some of the companies as they go through? Are they, like, is there a lot of preparedness as they suddenly realize that they're in a different kind of world with a different kind of expectation? What's that experience like?
I think yes is the answer, and it also depends again how potentially sophisticated or how systems driven the companies are and what the level of experience is for the management team. So if you are walking into a company that maybe has, been a public company, they're used to, strict reporting requirements and making sure you have backup for everything. So that is not unusual for, a finance team to basically move from public to private equity. I think where you come in maybe founder-led companies or companies that have not had significant external stakeholders, and just understanding, the change of reporting is usually the biggest sort of thing for folks to get their head around, that, they don't actually care about this, they care about that. So I need to change all my reporting requirements and make sure my systems can actually handle that. I think it really depends upon the experience of the team. If a team is potentially not used to working with private equity, they might have potential to think about, why are these people ask a lot of questions, and they do, because actually they're incredibly smart individuals. And it was funny. There was a time in my career where I worked with someone who had never worked with private equity, and they were on the executive team, and he kept trying to understand. He's like, why do they ask so many questions, and why are you, Dana, why are you spending so much time with these folks? And the answer is, well, number one, there are investors. Number two, they essentially own the company. So if the owners need something, and again, they need it because their funds require certain things. They're not asking for all this information for the fun of it. That's not what they do. They ask data. They ask for data because they need it, and they also need to understand the business. And sometimes that can be very hard to sort of get into a grind or a workflow with if you've never been through that, and sort of knowing that and being able to coach people and mentor might be a good word, and say, hey, listen, I know this and this is coming. Like I have had that conversation a couple times recently, is this is coming. They're going to say or ask for this. So just be on alert. We need to be ready for that. We need to make sure we can actually gather the data and provide a meaningful answer. Folks, I also try to explain to folks, you don't want to shoot from the hip. And might be a very American term, but you don't want to just sort of throw something out there when a question is asked. It's okay to actually say, when do you need the data by? Let me actually think about that and get you a more informed answer, because folks have a tendency to feel like they're under pressure. And if you're going to provide data or answers to questions, you don't want to make stuff up. You want to be very honest with them. And that also means in good times and bad times. Some folks who've never worked with private equity are like, oh, we can't tell them that. I'm like, no, it's actually quite the opposite. You do need to, we need to share this. And that's, for good times as well. We're in an interesting economic climate right now, but you have to share bad news as well. They need to know that. And some folks have just issues trying to get their head around that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they want to gloss over it without understanding actually they may have tools and capabilities that can be leveraged to support you through those challenging times.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, obviously, is there things that a business can do to prepare? Perhaps they're going out for a funding rounds, or they're looking to look good in front of their potential private equity investors. What sorts of things have you experienced them looking for or asking for from those kind of organizations?
So do your research first. If you are going to sell or you're going out to fundraise, make sure you understand the private equity firms that you might be talking to. And what I mean by that is different firms focus on different things. So you could have a PE firm that's a growth investor. So you're in a very specific life cycle of that company, and they're going to focus a lot on the revenues and what does that mean for cash flow and EBITDA, and how does that grow with the business? How much of the incrementals falling to the bottom line, versus you could be in a turnaround situation potentially where the private equity sponsor is going to be focused on, all right, how are we going to take cost out? How are we going to make the business better? How are we going to prop it up so that we can sell it in 3 years? So you have to also understand which direction they're coming from, because if you're going into a situation which is a turnaround, just a basic fundamental P&L question around the income statement, how are you going to track your costs? You want to make sure you're isolating your one-time costs. One-time costs are incredibly informative and need to be accounted for potentially in certain ways, especially if you know you're going to flip the business within a couple of years, because like most things, you take your one-time costs out to make your EBITDA a little bit better. I think the focus on cash flow could also be something that you need to figure out and understand where are they focused on P&L, or are they focused on free cash flow? And maybe your business has large swings between those two numbers. That could affect, if your EBITDA is one, but your cash flow is different because of potentially maybe you have a lot of assets, and it could be manufacturing or something that, requires CapEx that needs to be factored in, and you don't want to gloss over that. You also need to see if they're tax driven. Hopefully, enough to be dangerous on the tax side. We all have tax advisors because that's, we want the experts to control that. But I think you want to sort of understand which direction they're coming from. again, going back to the leverage situation, do they like levered companies or not? Good thing also is, phone a friend. So find out what other portfolios are in their mix. Usually it's on the website and you can sort of understand the team and then their portfolios. Find, often CFOs, my recommendation is find another CFO and another portfolio company that you can talk to, especially if you're being acquired by a PE firm. You want to understand how they work, what are their hot buttons. And the best person to tell you that is the CFO, is another one of their portfolio companies. Did that give you enough on that answer?
There's some great answers in there. There's a whole heap of tips for those that are sort of getting into it.
One more thing. This is going to sound a little crazy, but you have to be able to read the room. And this is probably my M&A background coming through, but you have to be able to sit in, whether it's in a virtual room or sometimes a lot of it is in person. And you have to be able to understand what's going on that's nonverbal. And there could be a lot of things going on that's nonverbal, or it may just, be a pretty open and honest discussion. But you often, it's funny because a lot of times when I am involved in selling either the company I'm working for or when I was in an M&A capacity, I would sit in the corner of the room so I could see the whole entire room, because I could see, the person over there rolling their eyes. And then you could also see when your team, another thing with private equity, get to the point. Don't take, probably a little bit of what I'm doing right now, take 10 minutes to answer a simple question, but get to the point. And if you're sitting and watching the nonverbal clues, you'll pick up on that. And that's what I generally mean by read the room. And a lot of that just comes from experience and being in whether it be a physical room or a virtual room with a bunch of strangers, and, being able to identify what's going on around the table.
Yeah. And I guess that's actually, it's probably sometimes as more challenging and less challenging with the era of COVID and all of the remote working. Obviously you get more visibility, but you can't always sense the same things, can you, via Teams as you do in person?
I would agree with that statement. But I think the eye rolling will still, you'll know as someone gets fidgety. When they start to fidget, that you might be losing them at that point.
Yeah. And this is great. So this is like top tips or top mistakes not to make. So when you look back over your career in private equity, what were the big things that you learned? Were there any sort of big challenges that kind of you look back on now and go, I wish I knew this before I went in?
Yeah, I think when you might be a little on the new side, or, a little green, as we say, I think the clues or the answers to the question, and I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I had come in again at point of deal, and we needed to basically get a set of auditors, because that's what CFOs do. We set up the audit and take care of the audit. And in choosing the auditors, I had asked, who do I have to use the Big Four? Do I need to, can I move down the list a little bit? Is there a requirement that you have? And they said, we have no requirements. We want it to be a fair price. Just make sure, and they named a firm, just make sure they're in the mix, because we'd like to see what they do. And that was it. And so I went down the path and did not choose that named firm, but choose another named firm. And the question came back, well, why did you choose that one and not the other one? And I'm like, well, did you want me to choose? Like, they're like, well, we mentioned, I'm like, yes, they were in the RFP, but this firm better pricing than that firm. And it became clear well after the fact, they actually wanted me to choose that firm they named. And I completely missed that sort of indication. It was a little subtle. So after the fact, I'm like, oh, well, all right, that was pretty stupid. I missed that one. And there's going to be something you miss. Like, just as a CFO of a PE sponsor, get used to it. Okay, you're going to miss something and you're going to do something stupid. Just pick up the pieces, learn from your mistakes, and move on. and understand sometimes what they're saying and ask that clarifying question. In hindsight, I had said to myself, I wish I had asked, do you want me to actually choose that auditor? Fundamental question. Don't be afraid to ask that question. And sometimes, you sort of get, well, I don't know if I ask that question, or am I going to look stupid? Did I miss the point? And sometimes you are going to miss the point, but you're never going to look stupid, because you're going to save yourself or the team a ton of time. And highly, highly recommend, don't be afraid to ask that dumb question, because I'll bet you 5 people in the room are thinking the same thing.
So, and I think that's a really good, because there is like you say, and you said it twice actually, is that there's some very smart people at the table in these private equity companies. And yeah, I guess that can be, as somebody coming into it, quite intimidating and not wanting to look stupid if you know that you've got smart brains in the room. But actually what you're saying is be the stupid one. And actually, that's not a bad advice, to be very fair.
Yeah. And you can't have an ego, because you also have to understand you are not the smartest person in the room. Just once you sort of get over that, you are not. And sometimes, depending upon, who the firm is, they will have a question, or they'll make a statement, or they'll sort of, go on a train about something. And you'll sit there and you'll say, my God, I don't even understand what the question was. and you're probably not, the CEO may also be sitting right next to you going, gosh, I don't really understand the question. And just don't be afraid to ask, because they're also looking at things from their lens. And as a CFO, you're also sort of used to looking out, but you need to kind of turn around and look in and use a different lens as you look at the business and say, hey, you know what? That's a really interesting question. We've never thought of that, or we've never looked at it that way. So have an open mind, and don't be afraid to say, I have no idea what that question was.
Love that. And to be fair, I think as a consultant, I have to not be afraid to ask the silly question, because sometimes it's really interesting when you get a silly answer back. But I think I think that's some great advice. So one of the things I'd love to ask is, like, obviously you've got a huge amount of knowledge and experience around private equity. Did you just gain this experience because you worked with them and in companies, or are there people that you spoke to help build your knowledge and build your your education as you went around?
It's a great question. And, my career has sort of been built by, some would call it by accident. Some would call it by just being in the right place at the right time. I think my first entrance into private equity was by accident. I actually went to work for a company where I divested a company to them, and then came back around to work at that portfolio company. And I did it because during the deal, I said, wow, these folks are really smart. They ask really intelligent questions, and they're going out and raising money, and I don't know what that actually means. So let me, just go spend some time working and learning. So I had the fortune of basically coming in, not as a CFO, coming in under the CFO, and having that CFO be a mentor to me. And that gentleman probably set my career. He doesn't know this. Well, he probably does know this, but he changed, I would say, the course of my career. And, I am one of those folks that just asks questions. I'm okay asking the stupid question, or saying, I don't quite understand that, or, what does that mean? And I think when you come in and take a company through the journey and at exit, you learn a lot, especially at the exit point, because it's all about the cap table at that point. And you have to just sort of understand who to ask the questions to. So if you're not the CFO or the CEO, ask to be involved. I mean, that's one of my recommendations to folks, because it is very hard to get into a PE-backed company if you don't have PE experience. And if you often look at the requirements, it often says either, PE or VC experience required. And the question is always, well, how do you get that? If you don't have it, how do you get in? And I think sometimes coming in not as a CFO and learning from the CFO or the COO or the CEO, or sometimes maybe if you're in a larger company and you're acquisitive, working on transactions that involve private equity sponsors on the other side of the table also is a way to sort of understand, another way, and this may sound completely insane, but I have actually a couple of very good friends that are in private equity because I was basically doing an alumni events thing for my graduate school, and I would do events and I wanted different types of investors on different types of panels, and interacting with folks on a much more personal or non-professional level. Their guard is down. They're happy to help. They're very busy people, but if they're an alumni, they're usually willing to help the school, and having that interaction and being able to just say, hey, I saw in the, news that you went out and bought this company, or how did you do it? How did you lever the company? What type of equity instruments did you use? What type of debt instruments are you using? Because private equity uses a myriad of a lot of different types, and it can be very complex. And you can end up in a very complex legal organization where you just have to understand that. So just asking your friends or being asked to, hey, could you introduce me to this person? Have a reason why, and don't take up a lot of their time if it's just to try to understand stuff, but have a very specific question in mind. And using alumni as sort of a buffer for some of this is often a good way in the back door, believe it or not.
Good way to get the knowledge without having to go through the front door, as they
exactly. And the front door could be an industry event, going to an industry event, or listening to a speaker on a panel and following up at them either after the panel or later on, and just saying, hey, I was there, I had this question, you said something about X, Y, and Z, could you elaborate?
And you mentioned obviously VC. So in terms of the differences between PE and VC, are they similar in how they operate, or is it very different being a CFO to a PE backed company versus VC?
It's similar, but there are unique differences. And this is from my experience. So in my experience, if you are at a VC backed company, you probably have quite a number of folks on your cap table. So you're going to have multiple, whether it be VCs or, there could be 12 people you're talking to every month. Whereas if you're private equity backed, depending upon whether they did a syndication or not, a lot of times private equity firms will take like the full ownership of the company. So there might be only one particular group you have to work with. So in that instance, it makes it a lot easier because there's only one individual versus having to deal with 12 investors. Or however many that you have. I'd say on the VC side, there's still an ask for information. It is going to be dependent upon the size of the VC and, again, where you are in your funding growth cycle. But I'd say probably the requirements in my history have been lighter than what they are on the private equity side. And then the debt and the leverage really sort of comes out truly on the private equity side a little bit more than the VC side.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And to be honest, I could keep asking questions, but I'm gonna finish with one. So what, from your experience and the conversations you've had with PE companies and investors, like what are the absolute no-nos for working with? What are the things that are the firing offenses that you need to make sure, the big mistakes that are gonna, impact your career if you're in PE?
Having an ego, thinking you are the smartest person in the room, not being responsive to your private equity sponsor, not being honest. I mean, if you are not providing the good, the bad, and the ugly on a timely basis, that is a huge no-no. That's a big no-no. No. And not being able to explain your business, explain your numbers, or answer their questions, or answering their questions with an answer that you prefer. that's pretty much a pretty big no-no. Not understanding debt, you can learn that and they can guide you on that. So never be afraid that you don't understand debt instruments, or even the equity instruments, or how the cap table looks, or why it looks that way. Those questions can always be answered, and you have lawyers also to help you with that. But you don't want to be aggressive or obnoxious, or sort of indifferent to your private equity sponsor. They're your partner, and they're there for a reason. They understand that you are running the business, but they do own the company, and you need to respect that, and you need to work with them. So always be a very good partner to them.
Amazing advice, Dana. And thank you so much for spending the time talking us through the ins and outs of private equity. And if people want to learn more about yourself and also the organization that you work with, is there any links or anything you want to share with us?
Sure. If feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. Dana Price. I'm on LinkedIn. I live in the New York City area, so that should pop up. There's probably very few Dana Prices. And then if you want to learn more about LifeLabs Learning, and what we do, it is literally LifeLabs Learning, very long URL, lifelabslearning.com. Please check us out there.
Amazing. And for all of our regular listeners, as usual, I'll pop both of those links into our podcast notes and make it super easy, even though it is a long URL. And I want to say a massive thank you, Dana, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and the do's and don'ts of working in private equity.
It has been a pleasure. Hopefully some of you learned a few things, and I was able to make a couple of you laugh. That's my goal in life. So I appreciate you having me, Hannah.
Oh, no, it's been amazing. And so for those of you listening, if there is a question I didn't ask, and there's probably quite a few because I've literally got a million written down that I wanted to ask. So please do reach out to me. You know where I am on LinkedIn. Send me a message. Tell me what I missed, and maybe if I ask very nicely, Dana will pop back on and answer those for us. So thank you very much, Dana. Thank you to our listeners for listening, and see you next time on the CFO podcast.